What if a missile Iran swore it would never build has already flown 4,000 kilometers and almost nobody outside a government hearing room even noticed? Before you scroll past this, understand one thing. This number is about to change how entire countries plan their defense. Hit that like button right now, not because I'm asking nicely, but because this video only reaches the people who need it if enough of you push it there in the first few minutes. Subscribe if you want the next update the second something new breaks. And if you know someone who still thinks this war is far away from them, send them this video today. For years, Iran repeated one line so often that people stopped questioning it. Their missiles, they said, would never fly past 2,000 kilometers. Not because they couldn't build something bigger, because they chose not to. That range was enough to hit Israel. It was enough to hit American bases scattered across the Gulf. And it let Iran keep telling the world its missile program was purely defensive, purely regional, nothing more. For a long time, that story actually made sense on paper. A missile that flies further needs a bigger body. It needs more fuel. It needs to survive a longer, faster, harsher flight without falling apart. Every extra 1,000 kilometers adds enormous cost and enormous risk. So when Iran said 2,000 was the ceiling, a lot of serious analysts believed that number wasn't just political talk, it was physics. To understand why range was always the real goal, you have to go back to where this program actually started. Iran's missile efforts trace back to the brutal war with Iraq in the 1980s. By the end of that war, Iran had almost no functioning air force left. Missiles became the replacement, a way to hit back without needing jets that could survive in contested skies. What started as a desperate survival tool slowly grew into something much bigger, a centerpiece of national strategy, protected and funded even during the darkest years of sanctions when almost every other part of the economy was suffering. Then, in March, that entire 2,000-kilometer story started falling apart in public, in front of everyone. On March 20th, Iranian forces launched 2 ballistic missiles at Diego Garcia, a remote American and British military base sitting alone in the middle of the Indian Ocean. This wasn't some random accident. Diego Garcia sits roughly 4,000 kilometers from Iranian soil. That's not a small stretch past what Iran had claimed for years. That's exactly double it. Neither missile hit the base. One broke apart mid-flight, the other was reportedly shot down before it got close. On the surface, that looks like failure. And technically, it was. But here's the part that actually matters. Nobody fires a missile 4,000 kilometers as a bluff. Bluffs are cheap and safe. This wasn't. Building and launching a weapon at that range, even one that fails, tells you that somewhere inside Iran's engineering pipeline, someone genuinely believed that distance was possible. For weeks, that launch stayed in the background, something analysts quietly debated among themselves. Then it stopped being quiet. During a Senate hearing on defense funding at the end of April, a top defense official confirmed on the record, under oath, that he personally witnessed a missile capable of traveling 4,000 kilometers being fired at Diego Garcia. Sit with that for a second. That's not a leaked document. That's not an anonymous tip. That is one of the most senior officials in the country testifying in front of Congress, confirming that Iran's public range limit had basically been a story the entire time. So now the world has a number that isn't speculation. 4,000 kilometers, confirmed. And that single number redraws the entire map. At that range, Iran isn't just capable of hitting Israel or bases in the Gulf anymore. That range reaches into North Africa. It reaches deep into the Middle East. It reaches straight into Western Europe. Berlin sits inside that circle. So does Rome. So does Paris. Even parts of Finland and Austria technically fall inside it. But 4,000 isn't the number that suddenly exploded across headlines this week. The number everyone is repeating now is 5,000. And where that number comes from actually matters, because it's not random internet speculation. Some defense analysts, including a former senior figure in Israeli military intelligence, have pointed to a platform called the KM-105. It's a satellite launch vehicle built by Iran's Revolutionary Guard, originally meant to put small payloads into orbit, not to strike ground targets. But here's the uncomfortable overlap most people don't think about. The physics behind launching a satellite and the physics behind firing a long-range missile are almost identical. Both require pushing a payload fast enough and high enough that it can travel an enormous distance before gravity finally pulls it back to Earth. According to that analysis, if this satellite platform were stripped down and repurposed for a military strike instead of orbit, it could theoretically reach distances up to 5,000 kilometers. Now, I want to slow down here because this distinction matters more than almost anything else in this entire story. 5,000 kilometers is a theoretical ceiling. It is not a confirmed operational weapon. There is currently no verified proof that Iran has built, tested, or deployed a missile in that exact form. There are even real open questions about whether the launch infrastructure needed to support something at that range is fully ready. So let's be precise. 4,000 kilometers is demonstrated, tested, and confirmed under oath by a senior official. 5,000 kilometers is a serious, technically grounded, worst-case projection, built on technology Iran already possesses in a different shape. Those are two very different confidence levels. Blurring them together helps nobody. It either makes the threat sound bigger than it currently is, or it makes people dismiss something dangerously real as pure hype. But here's what people miss when they only focus on what's already confirmed. Militaries never wait for a weapon to be fully proven before they start preparing for it. If you wait until something is fully combat tested before adjusting your defenses, you're already behind. So even treating 5,000 kilometers as a possibility rather than a guarantee, that number alone should already be reshaping how European governments, NATO planners, and Gulf states think about their air defenses right now today, not someday in the future. If this kind of breakdown is helping you actually understand what's real instead of just reacting to scary headlines, drop a comment telling me where you think this goes next. I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what I cover. Let's look at what Iran already has sitting in its declared arsenal, because that tells you exactly how much groundwork has already been laid for this moment. The centerpiece right now is a missile called the Kheibar Shekan, unveiled a few years back and formally put into active service earlier this year. Officially, Iran lists its range at 2,000 kilometers, with a warhead that can weigh close to 1,800 kilograms, an enormous payload for a missile in this class. But multiple independent assessments suggest its real potential range could stretch as far as 4,000 kilometers if it's fitted with a lighter warhead instead. That trade-off shows up constantly in missile design, and understanding it explains almost everything about how this story unfolded so fast. Strip weight off the front of the missile, and it can fly much further using the exact same fuel and the exact same engine. Nothing new has to be invented. You just swap a heavier payload for a lighter one, and a weapon supposedly capped at 2,000 kilometers can suddenly cover double that distance. Then there's Iran's answer to the global race for hypersonic weapons, a family of missiles that don't just fly in a straight, predictable arc. The first version is described as a maneuverable re-entry weapon, meaning it can actually shift direction during the final phase of its flight, which makes it dramatically harder to intercept. Reported speeds run as high as Mach 13 to 15, with an effective range somewhere between 1,400 and 2,000 kilometers. The next version goes even further, described as a true hypersonic glide vehicle capable of maneuvering through the atmosphere at speeds beyond Mach 15. And here's the part that should genuinely stand out to you. Both of these systems have reportedly already been used in real combat, not tested quietly in a lab, not shown off in a promotional video, actually used in an actual conflict. When you combine that kind of mid-flight maneuverability with extended range, you're not just making interception harder. You're breaking the basic assumption that most missile defense systems are built around, the idea that an incoming warhead follows a predictable path you can calculate in advance. A weapon that can change direction while it's already falling destroys that assumption exactly when it matters most. Compare that to how systems like Patriot, Iron Dome, and more advanced interceptors typically operate. Most of them are built to calculate a ballistic curve early in flight and plot an intercept point somewhere along that predictable arc. That works extremely well against older, simpler missiles. It works far less reliably against a warhead that can suddenly shift course during its final descent. So even setting the raw distance question aside completely, the fact that Iran now has combat-tested maneuvering warheads in its inventory already represents a real shift in the threat picture. Range gets the headlines. But maneuverability might actually be the harder problem for anyone trying to build a reliable shield against it. Go back to that Diego Garcia launch for a second, because that single event is really the hinge point of this entire story. Before that strike, most intelligence assessments placed Iran's practical maximum range somewhere around 3,000 kilometers. That was the working number defense planners were building their assumptions around. The attempt on Diego Garcia blew straight through that number and forced an almost overnight reassessment, because even a failed 4,000-kilometer strike tells you exactly where a program's ambitions actually sit. There's also a fairly simple technical explanation for how Iran managed to stretch its range that quickly. A former defense official pointed to the exact same trade-off we just talked about. Pair an existing missile body with a lighter warhead, and the whole thing becomes lighter overall, which means it can travel further using the same amount of fuel and the same engine. Same missile, same engine, same fuel, just a smaller punch on the front end in exchange for dramatically more reach. That's not some secret breakthrough. That's basic rocket physics, applied with intention. So step back for a second and think about why this actually matters beyond a number on a spec sheet. A missile with more range simply means more targets fall inside its reach, cross the 4,000 to 5,000 kilometer threshold, and an entirely new set of countries suddenly finds itself sitting inside the blast radius. At 4,000 kilometers, cities like Berlin, Rome, and Paris fall technically within reach. Push that number to 5,000, and you start pulling in places even further north, deeper into Central and Northern Europe than almost anyone expected a year ago. Now, technically within reach and realistically at risk are two very different things, and it's worth being honest about that gap. There's a real difference between a missile being physically capable of covering a distance and that same missile actually being accurate enough, reliable enough, and available in large enough numbers to matter. Iran's demonstrated accuracy at extreme distance has actually been fairly weak so far, and any missile aimed at a European target would have to fly over multiple NATO member countries along the way, which adds enormous risk of detection and interception long before it ever reaches its target. Every country along that path has its own radar coverage, its own early warning systems, and in some cases, its own layered air defenses. That doesn't make a strike impossible, but it does mean a missile fired thousands of kilometers away would likely be tracked from the moment it left the launch pad. That caveat is real, and it's fair. But here's the strategic problem it doesn't erase. Air defense planning doesn't get built around what an adversary can pull off with precision today. It gets built around what they might be capable of a year or two down the road, because missile programs improve constantly. By the time accuracy finally catches up to range, you want your defenses already sitting in place, not scrambling to catch up afterward. And that scrambling is already happening in a way that's creating real tension right now. Because of the intensity of the current conflict, a significant number of Patriot missile defense batteries have already been pulled out of Europe and redeployed toward the Middle East. On its own, that's a completely reasonable short-term decision. You defend whatever is actively under fire first. But the trade-off is unavoidable. Every interceptor battery pulled out of Europe to cover an emergency somewhere else is one less battery sitting in Europe. That's the quiet, unglamorous side of this story that barely gets any attention. It's not really about whether Iran can strike a European capital tomorrow. It's about how stretching the geographic threat force's already limited defensive resources to spread thinner across a much wider map. And thinner defenses anywhere create opportunity everywhere. If you've made it this far, that tells me you actually care about understanding this properly, instead of just reacting to a scary headline. So do me one favor, share this with one person who still thinks this war has nothing to do with them. Let's bring this back to the actual war unfolding right now, because none of this missile range conversation exists separately from it. This is happening in the middle of an active military campaign that has been running for months. Before this conflict escalated earlier in the year, Iran's declared missile stockpile was estimated somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 ballistic missiles. After sustained strikes throughout the spring and summer, intelligence estimates suggest that number may have dropped to somewhere closer to 1,500. That's a serious reduction, and it matters. But it isn't depletion, and it definitely isn't disarmament. Iran has shown clear signs of actively rebuilding that stockpile even while under continuous fire. And that tells you something important about internal priorities. A regime under this level of military and economic pressure doesn't keep funding missile production unless that program is treated as an absolute strategic priority. Just this month, the campaign escalated even further. Earlier in July, American forces struck more than 80 separate military targets inside Iran. That triggered exactly the kind of retaliatory response you'd expect. Iran's Revolutionary Guard claimed it launched missiles and drones at more than 80 American military positions across Bahrain and Kuwait in response. Iran's top negotiator went public afterward, accusing the United States of violating a prior agreement and warning of what he called a crushing response. That's the rhetoric. On the ground, the operational reality has been nearly 2 straight weeks of coordinated strikes against Iranian military infrastructure, targeting command centers, missile storage sites, drone production facilities, and coastal radar networks running the length of the country. So none of this missile range conversation is theoretical anymore. It's unfolding in real time right now while you're watching this. There's a pattern worth noticing in how these strikes have been targeted too. Command centers and storage sites don't get hit by accident, and they don't get hit first unless intelligence services believe they hold something worth destroying urgently. The fact that missile production infrastructure has been treated as a top priority target tells you planners take this program extremely seriously. You don't spend nearly 2 weeks hitting the same kind of targets unless you believe letting that capability grow unchecked is a far bigger risk than the strikes themselves. At the same time, it's worth being honest about how difficult it actually is to permanently eliminate a missile program through strikes alone. Buildings can be rebuilt. Engineers and technical knowledge survive even when the buildings around them don't. Iran has already shown that this program has a level of institutional resilience that pure military pressure struggles to fully erase. That doesn't mean the strikes are pointless. They clearly slow things down and force Iran to divert resources toward rebuilding instead of expanding. But slowing something down and stopping it permanently are two very different outcomes, and mixing them up leads to bad predictions. Now let's do a real honesty check here, because it's incredibly easy to get swept up in big, scary distance numbers without asking the harder question underneath them. What actually happens if Iran tries to use a long-range missile against a distant target under real combat conditions? Range on paper and range in practice are not the same thing. A missile still has to survive its entire flight without breaking apart. It still has to maintain accurate guidance across that entire distance. And it still has to punch through layered air defense systems that get more sophisticated the closer you get to NATO territory. There's also a cost factor that barely gets discussed. Building a missile capable of that kind of extended range is genuinely expensive. That almost certainly means Iran doesn't have many of them ready to go. And when you're launching in small numbers instead of overwhelming waves, you become dramatically easier to intercept. Modern air defense systems are specifically built to handle small numbers of high-value targets with real precision. The Diego Garcia launch is honestly the perfect example of exactly this limitation. 2 missiles fired. One broke apart before even completing its flight. The other was reportedly shot down. 0 for 2. That doesn't mean the underlying threat isn't real, but it does mean the threat right now looks more like a psychological signal than a battlefield weapon. So why would Iran even want a long-range weapon with a track record like that? Because the real value of this weapon was never really about winning a war with it. It's about changing the psychology of everyone watching. A missile that can theoretically reach Berlin doesn't actually need to hit Berlin to be strategically useful. It just needs to exist. That's deterrence through uncertainty, and it costs Iran remarkably little compared to the disruption it creates. One test launch and one piece of testimony under oath can force multiple European governments to start asking uncomfortable questions. It can force NATO planners to redraw threat maps that used to stop at the Eastern Mediterranean. Here's a detail worth sitting with for a moment. To genuinely threaten the mainland United States, Iran would need to extend its range all the way to 10,000 kilometers. That's still a massive technological leap beyond even the theoretical 5,000-kilometer ceiling. But analysts aren't primarily worried about that specific jump happening quickly. They're worried about something quieter underneath it. If Iran has already demonstrated a working staged launch system, then the hardest engineering problem has already been solved. Extending the range further from that point becomes an incremental challenge, not a fundamental one. That's essentially the same technological bridge North Korea crossed years earlier on its way toward genuine long-range capability, not through one dramatic breakthrough, but through slow, steady, incremental extensions of range that the outside world kept underestimating in real time. For years, analysts dismissed North Korea's early satellite launches as too unreliable to matter. Within roughly a decade, that same program had produced a demonstrated intercontinental capability that fundamentally changed global defense planning. If Iran is following a similar curve, then today's 5,000-kilometer conversation isn't really an isolated ceiling. It's a preview of what's coming next. None of this is lost on Iran's neighbors either. Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been investing heavily in their own defenses for years. They've watched Iranian drones and missiles used against shipping and infrastructure throughout this conflict already. They understand that a program capable of reaching Europe is already more than capable of blanketing the entire Gulf region. For these countries, The 5,000-kilometer conversation happening in Washington and Brussels isn't new information at all. There's one more thread worth pulling here before we wrap this up. Iranian missile technology has already been exported and used well beyond the Middle East. There is documented evidence of Iranian-made ballistic missiles being transferred to Russia for use in the war against Ukraine. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. The same engineering lineage behind these missiles is already being tested in a completely different active war zone. That's not a small footnote. That means there's already real combat performance data being generated on Iranian missile technology far away from Iran's own borders. And that feedback almost certainly finds its way back into how Iran keeps refining its own systems at home. Zoom out for a second and look at the wider picture. The attacks on shipping, the sustained strikes, the renewed sanctions, every single one of those pressure points feeds into the exact same underlying story. Iran right now is a regime fighting a pressure campaign on multiple fronts at once, facing military strikes on its own coastline and command infrastructure. Under that kind of combined pressure, a demonstrated long-range missile capability becomes an even more valuable card to hold onto. It's one of the few tools left that lets a weakened regime still command global attention. It's leverage disguised as capability. And honestly, sometimes the disguise and the reality aren't that far apart. So where does all of this actually leave us? The honest, grounded answer is this. 4,000 kilometers of range is confirmed, tested, and admitted under oath. 5,000 kilometers is a credible, technically grounded projection, but it remains unconfirmed as an actual deployed weapon. Somewhere between those two numbers sits the real threat picture today, a program that has already moved far past its old 2,000-kilometer story. Combat-tested maneuvering technology layered on top of extended range. A demonstrated willingness to test extreme distance targets, even when the test fails. None of that means a missile is landing on a European capital next week, but it does mean the strategic assumptions everyone built their plans around are already outdated, and the countries slowest to recognize that shift won't get the luxury of preparing calmly when it finally catches up to them. There's a bigger lesson sitting quietly underneath this entire story. Missile technology doesn't stay contained inside one country's borders anymore. Design knowledge, propulsion techniques, and guidance systems move between allied states faster than most people realize. What Iran learns from a failed Diego Garcia launch feeds directly into the next version. What gets battle-tested in Ukraine eventually feeds back into Tehran. Every piece of this story connects to every other piece, and treating it as some isolated range debate misses the entire point. This isn't a single dramatic headline. It's a live, moving system with feedback loops running in every direction at once, evolving faster than most policy can keep up with. That's really the story sitting underneath the scary number everyone keeps repeating. It was never just about whether Iran can technically reach a certain distance. It's about how quickly the rest of the world is being forced to adjust to a threat that used to sound distant and now genuinely doesn't. A year ago, a European defense official could reasonably say Iran's missile program was someone else's problem. Today, that same sentence would be flatly wrong, and everyone in that position already knows it. That shift from distant concern to direct exposure didn't happen with one dramatic announcement. It happened through a slow accumulation of test launches, quiet testimony, and numbers that kept climbing while most people weren't paying attention. And that's usually how the threats that matter most actually arrive. Not suddenly. Gradually until one day, suddenly. If this video helped you separate what's actually confirmed from what's still theory, that was the entire point of making it. Tell me in the comments where you honestly think this goes next, because I want to know if you think this becomes a real operational threat soon or stays a psychological one. Subscribe so you don't miss the next update, because this story is moving fast, and there's a lot more still coming.